Maybe that should be good.
Good. Excellent. Hope you can all hear me. If not, I can always switch to my lecture voice, but hopefully this will suffice. Before I begin today, I just want to acknowledge that I'm honored to be speaking to you in the beautiful ancestral traditional territories of the Legacies peoples. Welcome to my talk today. Thank you so much for having me. This is the second time that I have been in this building. The first time was, I think, 31 years ago when I was nominated for the Royal United Services Institute Book Prize in Military History for my directed studies paper that I did with Dr. David Zimmerman. So this is a peculiarly full circle moment for me, as it turns out. Anyway, I was invited to talk about the experiences of Indigenous peoples in the Second World War. And it's something I've spent more than a couple decades conducting research into the history, examining government military policies around recruitment, conscription, veterans benefits, and the Homefront, as well as Indigenous peoples' experiences of war and military service. This is a story that has emerged then out of decades of collective and public forgetting onto the national stage over the last 30 or 35 years or so. Much of this has been driven by the efforts of Indigenous veterans organizations, particularly those of the Second World War, beginning in the 1970s and gaining strength through the 1980s and 90s. They raised the profile of their contributions and sacrifices in Canada's wars, as well as of their grievances regarding inequities in veterans' benefits and the handling of those benefits in the wake of those conflicts. Now, their demands for recognition of their contributions challenges the existing efforts at commemoration and remembrance and began to foster change through the 1990s, the early 2000s, and into the 2010s. Indigenous people began to participate in both national as well as local acts of remembrance and commemoration, laying wreaths at November the 11th, beginning in the 1990s. In 2003, First Nations veterans received an apology and compensation for inadequacies in the handling of their veterans' benefits. In 2019, Métis veterans received a similar state compensation and acknowledgement. There is now a National Aboriginal Veterans Memorial in Ottawa, a few hundred meters down Elgin Street from the National Memorial. There is a National Aboriginal Veterans Day on November the 8th, which began as a grassroots effort in Winnipeg in 1994, but has gained national traction and recognition. And there are other efforts I might mention as well, but the point, I think, is that change, both symbolic and substantive, has taken place. And yet, this remains an uneasy process. It is fraught, it is often uncomfortable, particularly for non-Indigenous Canadians and for institutions, because it can challenge elements of how Canada's wars are remembered. But for those of us who are interested in exploring and explaining Canada's military history, it behooves us to engage in this process, particularly given the momentum that the broader national process of reconciliation has granted to this subject, amongst others. And so what I want to do today is to provide some historical background to Indigenous military contributions in the Second World War. I'll touch on the Great War, but I want to focus primarily on the Second World War. I'll provide an overview of military service by Indigenous people, of Homefront Experiences, and of the transition back to peacetime at the end of the Second World War. But then I also want to talk a little bit about the ways we as Canadians recall this conflict, the narratives that frame our broader collective memory. These are often entwined in the overarching narratives of the good war, as we like to think of it, a lens that is both comforting and nostalgic. But what happens when the experiences of a person or a community or a people don't mesh with the national narrative, the national story? Well, in the past, that's often meant those stories get marginalized. They get forgotten, they get ignored. And so I think finding ways to include and foreground those stories is what reconciliation can look like then in the field of military history. That's the National Aboriginal Memorial and other elements to keep in mind. All right, just a little bit of background now. Prior to the 20th century, Indigenous peoples had a millennia-long legacy of warfare, both intertribal warfare and conflict with incoming settler frontiers. Since the Norse landings at Lancea Mado 1,000 years ago, conflict and warriors that conducted that conflict became important in the social, the cultural, and the political lives of many First Nations. We need to be careful about those assumptions because it's easy to essentialize that, to assume that all Indigenous peoples were somehow warlike or natural warriors, kind of replicating old stereotypes and the ways in which Indigenous soldiers and warriors were framed from the 18th well into the 20th centuries. Not all Indigenous societies actually venerated warriors, including Coast Salish peoples, for example. For our purposes, these experiences informed important elements within Indigenous oral traditions that would shape their responses to war in the 20th century. Indigenous nations, however, are incredibly diverse, and no two would bring the same historical background to their experience in the Great War or in the Second World War. Some nations had a centuries-long legacy as opponents of the British and later Canadian settlements in their lands. For the Mi'kmaq, for example, in Nova Scotia, that tradition of resistance dates back into the 1600s. But it's worth recalling that for other nations, there were also centuries-old traditions of fighting as allies of the British Crown. And those were fundamental to their culture and identity. And you had many nations, like the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, Southern Ontario and Quebec, who had a complex blend of both. Now, Indigenous participation as soldiers in the wars of empire would be the new iteration as we get past Confederation and the geographic consolidation of Canada, which would see the suppression of intertribal conflict as well as settler-Indigenous conflict, and that would transition Indigenous warriors' roles, both within their communities and beyond. In some cases, young Indigenous men transitioned into being soldiers, fighting overseas in the service of the British Empire. Several hundred riverboatmen, for example, were enlisted by the British Army to ferry a British army up the Nile River to relieve the siege of Khartoum in 1885. And many of those were First Nations or Métis. And there were likely a few as well that would have joined the contingents of Canadians that sailed to South Africa to take part in the Boer War, though the racism of that era makes it likely their numbers were tiny. By contrast, much more important was the experience of the Great War. Unlike the Boer War, after 1914, more than 4,000 First Nations men and an unknown number of Métis served in the Canadian Army. And roughly 300 status Indians were killed in action. The majority of those who served were scattered as individuals throughout regular battalions in the forces. Martial race theories of the day meant that they faced expectations from commanders, from fellow soldiers, that expected them to be naturals at scouting and sniping. And they were probably overrepresented in the sniper teams as a result of this. Nevertheless, some did bring lateral skills in hunting from home, which made them very effective in this work as well. Some of them achieved a lot of fame. Francis Pegamagabo, probably the most famous of these, unofficial kill total of 378, might have made him the single most deadly individual in the entire war. I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect that. You had others like Henry Norwest, a Métis, with 114 kills. There were efforts as well to enlist some men in segregated all-Indian units. Two battalions, the 107th and the 114th, were given permission to recruit outside their geographical area amongst Indigenous populations in an effort to create an all-Indigenous unit. Neither was entirely successful in doing that. I think the 107th had about 500 First Nations men amongst their quota when they went overseas. The 114th was broken up when it arrived in the UK. The 107th was transitioned into a pioneer battalion and moved to the Western Front and served at the Battle of Hill 70 with some distinction. But when the Canadian Corps reorganized its engineering assets through the winter of 17-18, they were disbanded and reassigned. Now, importantly, when Canada passed the Military Service Act in 1917, bringing in conscription, no thought was given to the impact this would have on Indigenous people. And yet, it raised a huge wave of protest from Indigenous leadership throughout the country, and the government, somewhat surprised, responded by passing an order in council. PC 111 on the left-hand side is the document, which provided a limited exemption from having to be sent overseas to status Indians. The rationale was partly based on verbal treaty promises that had been made during treaty negotiations in the 19th century, but it connected back to the lack of the franchise as legal wards of the state, and to other peoples who were also disenfranchised under the Wartime Voters Act, who were also exempt from being sent overseas. Nevertheless, while all of these were removed at the end of the war, Indigenous communities remembered that exemption in the Second World War, and it helped to fuel extensive resistance and opposition to conscriptive measures after 1940. When the war ended, status Indian service personnel were largely excluded from the relatively limited veterans benefits and programs that were available after the Great War. That would have been painful enough, but it was made doubly so by the fact that for the Soldier Settlement Plan, the primary agricultural veterans program, more than 80,000 acres of good agricultural land was actually stripped out of reserves in the prairies in Ontario to settle non-Indigenous veterans. So the story of Indigenous participation then in the First World War largely gets subsumed into broader public narratives of expressions of loyalty to king and empire. That's how we tend to think of it. And it's also often painted as a sign of successful assimilation, programming, and administration by the Department of Indian Affairs, much of this driven by Duncan Campbell Scott, who was then the Director of Indian Affairs, who was the keenest to popularize that interpretation of Indigenous participation. It never occurred to Canadians at the time to ask First Nations communities what the war, in fact, had meant to them. The interwar years that followed would be difficult ones for Indigenous people, particularly the Depression years, where they were often the first to be fired and the last to be rehired, given their marginal economic position in the country. So in some ways, the outbreak of war in 1939 offered the prospect, yes, of strife and of sacrifice and loss, but also of opportunity, economic and otherwise. In terms of military service, first and foremost, the opportunity to volunteer. And Canadian Indigenous populations were heavily involved in the Second World War effort here in Canada and abroad. Estimates would suggest about 4,300 status Indians served during the war. Most of those voluntary enlistments, a few may have been conscripts. We don't know the number of Métis or non-status Indian enlistments that there were. Probably in the thousands, maybe a couple thousand if we had to guess. And they served primarily in the Army, more than 90%, maybe 95%. And the reason for that, in fact, had something to do with enlistment policies in the RCAF and the RCN that required applicants to be of pure European descent and of the white race in order to have an application accepted. That color line was not removed until 1942 for the Air Force and 43 for the Navy, at least in theory. High education requirements as well, and those very tech-heavy services often required senior or junior matriculation in order to accept an enlistment, also provided structural barriers to would-be Indigenous enlistees. In the interwar years, probably about 3% of status Indian children who received education actually made it through to that level of education. So most then found their way into the Army. So why did they serve? This is one thing where we see no single rationale. But it's a question that anytime I talk about this subject, people always ask me. Some of the rationales were ones that they shared with non-Indigenous recruits. Economics, desire for a good job, 3 square meals a day after the Depression. Desire for adventure, because all their buddies were going. Or patriotism, though Indigenous patriotism probably looked and felt a little different than that for other Canadians. But some clearly also volunteered for reasons that were distinct to Indigenous peoples. For some, it was to uphold commitments to treaties that their people had signed with the Crown. They felt a sense of obligation from that. For some, it might have been cultural. The desire for young men to attain warrior status within their own community, their own people, and the social standing that came with that. And for others, enlistment was a political act to prove their worth or to gain access to greater rights and autonomy. Tommy Prince, who's the most highly decorated and well-known Indigenous soldier of the Second World War, once said that he enlisted because he wanted to prove that an Indian was as good as any white man. And he always wore his indigeneity on his sleeve all through his service. He always made sure those around him knew he was an Indian because he was trying to prove a point. Once in the services, Indigenous soldiers were accepted as one of the boys or girls. Several dozen Indigenous women also served during the war. Many felt respected for the first time in their lives, sadly sometimes for the last time in their lives, for their courage or their capabilities. Military service provided opportunities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians to actually get to know one another in a way that was not common in pre-war Canadian society, which was still highly segregated. By all accounts, Indigenous soldiers, sailors, Air Force personnel served on par with their non-Indigenous colleagues. They were promoted into NCO, in some cases into officer positions like Lieutenant Huron Brant. This is Brigadier Oliver Martin, highest ranking Indigenous soldier of the Second World War, who would command a brigade here on BC's west coast, defending against a potential Japanese invasion in 1943. On the home front, broadly speaking, there was a wartime spirit of solidarity that began to lower some of those walls of prejudice that Indigenous people had experienced before the war. It didn't disappear, but First Nations leaders in various parts of this province and elsewhere still complained, for instance, about not being allowed into local community establishments like theaters and restaurants. But overt exclusion and some of the more hateful interactions seemed to have moderated in that wartime spirit of togetherness. And that got balanced against more positive experiences and more opportunities economically for First Nations. And as in the military, the war brought people together in ways it didn't before. A lot of Indigenous people left reserve and moved into urban centers to work in wartime industries, again, coming into closer contact with Indigenous people than would have been typical before the war. And others found work in mills, mines, salmon fishing industries closer to home that often during the Great War or the Great Depression had been closed to them. And because most of that work was conducted off reserve, it also meant they were paying income taxes on most of what they were earning, and thus contributing to the wartime economy as other Canadians were. So with so many people working, enlisted in the military, or producing goods from reserve agricultural lands, Indigenous Canadians were never as prosperous as they were during the 1939 to 1945 period, since the beginnings of colonization, and probably since, relatively speaking. This was, in many ways, the best of times economically for Indigenous people in Canada. Beyond the economics, Indigenous populations also participated in patriotic and charitable fundraising, like, for example, an Indigenous Spitfire Fund that the Squamish Nation organized, which was to be an all-Indigenous fundraising effort to raise enough money to buy a Spitfire. And there were all kinds of other endeavors. And often First Nations also participated in broader community endeavors to buy Bren guns, to give to victory bonds, and a host of other things. In fact, many bands were making contributions from band funds, which were held in trust in Ottawa, so much so that the Indian Affairs branch actually shut down that form of giving because those were finite dollars. And so most of the giving that they did subsequent to that was private and in the millions. All of these efforts often involved whole communities. And I think it makes clear that Indigenous engagement in the war effort was much deeper and broader then a few bulletproof 18-year-old men enlisting for an adventure. Nevertheless, having expressed a desire to take part, to contribute, it didn't mean these communities were giving the federal government a blank check either. Indigenous communities throughout the war struggled to manage the limits of their consent and try to control or exert some control over the nature and the extent of their contributions. This was most evident when we get to talk of conscription. While the bulk of First Nations and Métis communities supported or at least acquiesced to their young men volunteering to serve, they often opposed vehemently state measures to force their young men into the military. From the initial national registration of the population in August of 1940 under the National Resources Mobilization Act, any new measures in the incremental development of Canada's conscription during the Second World War would provoke strong reactions from Indigenous leaders, communities, and individuals from coast to coast to coast. And this was the case throughout the war. Mostly this took the form of written letters and petitions of protest sent to the government, to the British High Commissioner, the Governor General, Prime Minister, the King. Usually those then would get rerouted back to the Department of Indian Affairs, who would write the Indian agent, who would then chastise the person who sent it to say, you're supposed to send it through proper channels, which is through the Indian agent and back through Indian Affairs. But there wasn't a lot of success doing that, so they protested outside those channels. There was also widespread passive resistance of men refusing their call-up, refusing to report for a medical exam. Sometimes this was done with the encouragement or the collusion of elders and the community. There were other issues as well that were opposed: wartime taxation, military land usage, a range of other longer-standing issues that predated and would post-date the war. So I'm not suggesting that the Second World War home front was rainbows and unicorns. But generally speaking, the war years were economically good ones for Indigenous communities. The end of the war, of course, would have been a joyous occasion for Indigenous peoples, as it was for all Canadians, as they eagerly awaited the safe return of loved ones from overseas. But here on the home front, this excitement must also have been tempered by the bleak economic prospects for Indigenous families once the soldiers returned from war. While the war had offered up many opportunities for good-paying jobs and steady employment, with so many young Canadian men and women away in uniform, their return meant that people who had stepped in to fill the void, primarily women, but also Indigenous and other minorities, now faced very heavy pressure to vacate those jobs and to make space for returned service personnel. For most Indigenous communities, this entailed returning to their own communities and to seasonal work and limited opportunities in the margins of Canada's economy. For returning Indigenous veterans, however, their outlook was a little different from their families back home. Many of them returned home with sky-high hopes and expectations. They were just as excited to return home to their loved ones as all the Canadian veterans, chomping at the bit overseas until a boat could be made available to get back home. No question. But what they had experienced in uniform was acceptance and respect. And they'd gained in confidence in dealing with settler Canadians. They'd acquired linguistic skills, leadership skills, mechanical skills that they could translate into their life after wartime service. And they expected that acceptance and that inclusion to continue once they returned home. Sadly, that was rarely the case. Many Indigenous veterans subsequently became bitter and disillusioned that once they took their uniform off, they were just an Indian again. And societal prejudice continued on in Canada, evolved somewhat, but not that changed from the pre-war years. For veterans, these challenges were made more difficult by their struggle gaining access to information and to the various programs of the Veterans Charter. Veterans Charter in the Second World War is a bevy of very generous programs, very flexible benefits set up by a grateful nation to convey its appreciation to veterans for their sacrifices and service. It was, of course, also designed to ensure that veterans made a successful integration back into civilian life and found ways to support themselves and their families going forward. so that they wouldn't become a restive element as they had during the unrest of 1918, 1919. And by and large, these programs worked exceptionally well for the vast majority of Canadian veterans. And there were more than 1 million of them. But it didn't work equally for all. The programs were designed to build on a foundation of service that the service personnel had developed before they joined the military. Foundational stones of education, of work experience or an existing job, of land and agricultural experience, for instance. Yes, they were flexible. They were designed to fit a wide range of Canadians. But if you lacked one or all of those pre-war building blocks, it was much more difficult to translate the Veterans Charter benefits into a successful post-war reestablishment. And then you mix into this that Indian affairs became entwined in the administration of status Indians, Indian veterans' case files. So you get an extra layer of bureaucracy between the veteran and veterans' affairs in the form of Indian affairs, who were largely ignorant of what was supposed to happen and mostly intruded and caused problems, and sometimes warped some of the benefits programs to match Indian affairs agendas rather than the purpose for which they were originally intended. And Métis veterans faced different challenges, often falling through the cracks. They were too Indigenous for the provinces to accept them as citizens and therefore provide services, but they were not Indigenous enough for the federal government to deal with them. And so they fell into the cracks in between often. Returning home, Métis cultures in the interwar and post-war years were not used to accessing government services, and so they often lived a highly mobile life, moving quite regularly for seasonal work, living in makeshift conditions without a regular address, all of which complicated accessing veterans' benefits. And so the contrast, I think, then is really quite clear that Canadians, even if they didn't know it in 1945, were embarking on a decades-long period of almost continuous growth and prosperity that would last through into the early 70s. But most Indigenous veterans and their families missed that train as it left the station in the years immediately after the war. Now, clearly, the war experience of Indigenous people were varied and has left, I think, an equivocal legacy. But the decades since 1945, for the victorious, of course, the Second World War has increasingly come to represent the good war of the 20th century. It's untainted by the soulless, seemingly pointless, attritional combat of the Great War. We don't have the ambiguity of the ending of the Korean War, or the moral murkiness of later conflicts in Vietnam or Afghanistan. For Canadians, the Second World War has always appeared uncontestably good, necessarily, morally righteous, and ably fought. And scholars have extensively explored the contours of the good war narrative, focusing on a series of the usual touchstones that help to frame that event in our minds. First, massive economic growth. See the acceleration of the country's industrialization, supercharge of the primary economy after the doldrums of the Depression years, full employment by 1941. Canada's gross domestic product more than doubling during the war years. We very much became an arsenal for democracy and a food and resource producing major allied power. We talk often about progressive social change as another key cornerstone of that good war. Mostly this focuses on the massively expanded roles for women in the wartime economy, as well as in the armed forces, the birth of Canada's social welfare system, and the legal recognition of labor's right to unionize and strike. We talk about relative political unity. The bitter divisions over conscription, which almost broke Canada apart in 1917-18 along Anglo-French linguistic fault lines, were avoided this time around through Prime Minister Mackenzie King's deft handling, or avoiding, if you will, of the issue, as well as a broad social acceptance of Canada's involvement in the war and a spirit of wartime solidarity. Military success is another key component of the good war. It was a good war because we won. Canada's substantial forces on land, sea, and in the air were significant contributors to Allied victory. In Western Europe, in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the strategic bombing campaign over occupied Europe. And collectively, all these factors are said to have marked the nation's coming of age as a mature middle power. And there's a lot of reality and data that helps to support that narrative. While much less discussed, the aftermath of the Second World War for those individuals and those communities that lived through its challenges and its sacrifices was just as important to the memory of the good war as anything that happened during the war. After the First World War, the vindictive peace treaties, the economic hardship of the post-war years, the global influenza pandemic that killed tens of millions, all left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had fought the war to end wars. Veterans were provided access to some reestablishment benefits and pensions, but they were rigid, they were poorly funded, and frankly mean-spirited. And as a result, many veterans felt abandoned upon their return home. That was then followed by the Great Depression. And so many veterans, amongst others, felt that while we had won the Great War, we somehow managed to lose the peace. Second World War, the Allied governments worked very hard to try to avoid those same mistakes. And here in Canada and in other Western Allied nations, the transition to peace was smoother, without a sharp recession as in 1918 to 20. This time there were generous veterans benefits, a growing social welfare system to help the million-plus veterans here in Canada successfully transition back into the civilian economy. And in part due to this, Canada entered into a decades-long period of growth and prosperity. The good war, then, is good in no small measure because the peace that followed it was good too. So, how then do we reconcile Indigenous experiences in war and Indigenous veterans into that structure of remembrance? Well, based on what I've suggested today, I think it's clear the good war continues to frame our collective remembrance of the Second World War, that some people's experiences, therefore, don't fit that narrative. It is an appealing narrative. As historian Jeff Keshen has said in his book, Soldiers, Saints, and Sinners, that the good war comforts, but it also clouds. In many ways, the popular memory was sanitized and simplified, and a complex and problematic event whose legacies for Canada were not just profound, but also contradictory. We do already accommodate some things that don't fit the good war narrative, and the most important and notable is the appalling treatment of those of Japanese ancestry who were resident here in BC during the Second World War, who were rounded up, whose goods were sold off, and many who were expatriated in the wake of the war. And so we acknowledge that, and it's really the one narrative that gets to dent the good war narrative, I think. We've accepted that. So this is doable. We can accommodate alternate narratives that don't necessarily fit the contours. Parts of Indigenous peoples' experience in the war do mesh with the components of the good war narrative. The economic boom on the home front, they very much participated in. They also experienced some of the social change, the enhanced acceptance, even if it was temporary. And of course, success in military service. But unlike most Canadians, in many ways, Indigenous veterans and communities wound up losing the peace after 1945. Their veterans were mostly unable to translate Veterans Charter benefits into a prosperous post-war life. Their communities were once again pushed to the margins of the Canadian economy and by and large back into poverty. Still, they were denied citizenship rights. The right to vote, federally at least, was not awarded until 1960. Despite having sacrificed and died in defense of those rights, alongside comrades in arms who possessed them. And I think it's this aspect that's most difficult to address, and in some ways undermines some of that concept of the good war. So how do we collectively move forward then on a path of reconciliation in presenting this history to a Canadian public who might feel some dissonance with their own existing collective memories? Well, partly we do it by making room for more nuance in our collective memories. We shouldn't shy away from these stories that challenge the comfortable assumptions and the warm, fuzzy lens of the good war. Me talking to you today is part of that, I think. Efforts are being made to rebuild and situate this history in the academic literature. That's something I spent more than 25 years working on. And to address some of the wrongs of the past through acknowledgement and compensation where appropriate. And publicly also to include Indigenous people, communities, and veterans in local, in national, and sometimes in distinctly Indigenous acts of remembrance and commemoration. I find I'm more optimistic than I once was about Canadians and Indigenous peoples crafting a more mutually respectful and functional relationship going forward. The momentum of the agenda around reconciliation, I think, seems to be rolling, and perhaps irreversibly so. And in this process of reconciliation, we'll be asked to be uncomfortable, to look at and to acknowledge a sometimes dark and shameful history. That has to be faced and acknowledged before we can move forward collectively. But I would suggest there's also value in foregrounding stories where Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians work together in a spirit of equality and mutual respect in a common cause, and achieve remarkable things together. And the stories of Indigenous military service and sacrifice in the Canadian Armed Forces are perhaps better placed to do that than any others. I think I'll end there, but I'm happy to take questions if there are questions. Sure.
A couple of questions. One from the beginning of your talk and one from the end. The beginning you're talking about sort of the martial races that existed, etc. During the Second World War, there was a lot of reference to German documents of Canadian infantry being good at Indiana craft. I wonder, where did that come from in terms of European and German attitude? The other question is, after the war, is there any indication, or has anybody done any research on regimental and unit histories as to whether regimental associations, service corps associations, etc., did any advocacy on behalf of their First Nations members, or even had informal programs of just helping their comrades out with jobs, things like that?
Yeah, good questions both. I'll start with the first one. Indigenous peoples were an interestingly a source of vast and long fascination in German society. This was the case dating back to the 19th century. You had German aristocrats and artists who traveled the American West, painted and wrote books about their experiences there. And so there's this enduring legacy. We see it still today. There's like a theme park, an Indigenous kind of theme park you can go to in Germany, where people dress up and play Indian, and they actually hire Indigenous people from North America, New Zealand, elsewhere. Anyway, it's kind of weird by our standards, I think, but it's an enduring fascination. One of the strangest things I ever read was an article about East German cinema. 45-year period. During that period in East German cinema, they made hundreds, 200 or 300 westerns, in which the Indigenous people got to overwhelm the imperialists, of course. Of all things in East Germany, Western movies of cowboys and Indians films were not the first thing I would have expected to see. So that there is a long-standing and enduring fascination with that, a sort of expectation that all of the Canadians were going to be Indigenous, and again, both fascinated and terrified because of the mythology that was, spoken about around that in German society. In terms of veterans' support for Indigenous veterans after the war, yes, there was. There was a lot of advocacy, actually, around trying to do better in Canada's dealings with Indigenous people. That created a fair amount of pressure on the federal government through 1944, 45. And in 1946, they announced the creation of a special joint parliamentary committee to revisit the Indian Act and basically give Canadian Indian policy a thorough going over. And a big part of what helped to pressure that was the Legion and other veterans organizations, who were, many of them, I think, surprised and shocked that at the very least they wanted their comrades in arms to get the vote. But everybody talked about, doing right by the Indian. They served, they sacrificed on equality. We can do better going forward. So there definitely was some pressure to do that. But there were also challenges. Legion halls served alcohol. And of course, up until 1951, and the new India Act is passed, there was a legal ban on Indians entering establishments that served alcohol, which meant status Indian veterans couldn't enter into a Legion hall. Which, of course, for veterans was one of the main places they heard from their buddies about different programs. Who's doing what? Oh, how's that working out for you? So that they were cut off from that informal network. And I'm not sure subsequent to the end of the ban on liquor consumption, whether or not many of them found their way back to the Legion or other veterans organizations. They may have, but I don't know the answer to that.
A couple of points. First of all, my platoon included a stores corporal named Chan Duncan, who was very First Nations. Everybody knew. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't giggled about. And he was a very fine man. Everybody knew it. The second thing, about 3 or 4 slides in from this presentation, there was a poster. It was absolutely disgusting term way back.
Oh, the First World War one?
The guy said, my skin is dark, but my heart is white.
Yes.
That one.
Yes.
That is appalling. I could not be publicly put today without causing a riot.
Of course.
And I'd be one of the rioters. That's from what, First World War?
First World War. This was Canadian Patriotic Fund, which of course supported families of men serving overseas.
One more small point.
Yeah, sure.
For 9 years, my wife and I had a bed and breakfast out west of Souk. Every summer, we had a whole lot of German tourists. And they would go to the Po Bowl, as they call it, the powwow, the Sioux Nation and everything. And we were very surprised because Germany is not that big a part of the population of the world. But they were there all the time. I even learned to say to the little kids, I forget, "Möchtest du mir helfen futtern die Gänse?" Which is, help me feed the geese, because the kids love to feed the geese, right? And it was a big, and it's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I don't entirely understand it, but I think it has to do with some pop culture publications in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, which were quite famous and everybody read, and as a result...
Grey Owl.
Grail's a little bit later,
Grey, yeah.
but he also...
But it's time, having lived in northern Germany and in the Black Forest
Yeah.
For a total of 7 years, it's tied to their love of nature and their almost mythological love of forests.
Yeah.
And they see Canada. In fact, my whole time there, the #1 graduation present for finishing Hochschule was to send your kid to Canada for a year,
Interesting.
just so they could see the forests.
Yeah.
Of course, they don't go drinking in Toronto, but
Well,
Excellent, yeah.
Before I joined the regular force, I was a member of the Algonquin Regiment, and we were mobilized in 1940 for World War II. We had, according to our regimental history, about 100 Indians joined.
Yeah.
They virtually all failed the M test, and the authorities said, well, they should not be enrolled. And our commanding officer protested, saying, take a look at the parts of the test where something is missing. And they identified every case, spokes on wheels, everything else. He said they make superb soldiers. And they joined the regiment.
Yeah, the medical tests could be a real problem. There were certain jurisdictions during the war where I think it was a local recruiting officer, a senior regional district or military district recruiting officer in the case of Manitoba and Northwest Ontario, who were of the opinion that Indians didn't make good soldiers. And so there were some time periods where the ability to get recruited was shut off, or where there's one case in Norway House in northern Manitoba where a letter was sent to Indian Affairs, who passed it along to General Ralston, who was the Minister of Militia and Defense, and he sent a mobile recruiting unit because they said, oh, there's 55 healthy young men who want to enlist. But they were told they weren't wanted. So he sent a mobile recruiting unit. They assessed them all. 2 were accepted. The rest were not, primarily because of tuberculosis has been rampant in these communities in the interwar period. Those 2 then went to Winnipeg and were subsequently failed out and sent home. So in that case, you had a 100% rejection rate, or potentially the 4,300 number that we know of status Indian enlistees might have been much higher. But in some of the medical stuff, there were real problems under that.
General Herb Pitts, who was a member of Lucy here, he is well known and a veteran of the Korean War. He commanded Tommy Prince, and I had a chance to interview him about Tommy. But more to the point, I also interviewed a World War II parachute battalion vet. He was a brother in the Franciscans, and he personally knew Tommy. And what Brother Paul said about Tommy was really interesting. He talked about this special quality as a warrior, and this sort of spiritual level, lack of fear, and ability to conceptualize and move within that spiritual dimension. He said that was extraordinary in the man, and that was his strength during, the Second World War. Of course, the Korean War was quite different, and when I talked to General Herb Pitts, he found that those qualities within that theater were more problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that's very difficult to reconstruct is what the experience of being in combat, being in a small unit, in a section, in a platoon was like for an Indigenous soldier. I mean, undoubtedly, basic training breaks down a lot of the civilian background and culture and that sort of thing, and reconstructs you as a member of your unit. But you still bring a lot of yourself with you, right? And the understandings, the cultural understandings of things like what is it to be brave? What does sacrifice look like? What does good leadership look like? It's very different in Indigenous societies than it is in a drill sergeant major. They're very different things. And so there was a lot of culture shock. But I often wonder how much of that cultural self they functioned in and felt in exercising their duties as a soldier, airman, or whatever. I've heard similar stories from others about Indigenous soldiers, and it's something I've sort of dabbled with, but from a historical perspective, I can't. It's hard to find evidence of how do you measure that. What does that look like? And it's so individualistic as well, But there's no doubting Tommy Prince was an exceptionally effective soldier. The Second World War, he was remarkable. And he came back for a second tour in Korea. He didn't finish it, partly because his knees were terribly arthritic, and also because very likely he was suffering PTSD by that stage. It's not talked about, but it's very likely that he was struggling mentally at that stage after so much combat. Actually, a lot of Indigenous soldiers came back for Korea, in part because they came home from the Second World War and were disillusioned. And like Tommy, they found meaning and purpose and acceptance in the military, and so re-enlisted. One of my colleagues was doing a master's or PhD, actually with Dr. Zimmerman, looked at Korean War. And some of the people he talked to said that apparently when 2 PPCLI was recruiting to go overseas, some were joking that PPCLI stood for Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Indians, because so many Indigenous men had reapplied. Second World War vets had reapplied to go to Korea. That's the only anecdote. I don't have any hard data to support that, but it speaks to, an elevated sense of this being important. Yeah.
I didn't understand.
Reflecting on the difficulty that Indigenous veterans had in accessing benefits, do you have any evidence of success by those who were able to access them?
It's challenging because it's hard to measure. It's not simply about the amount of money you got. One of the things that we see happen, for instance, is that the vast majority of Second World War veterans, Canadian Second World War veterans, and I don't remember the exact stats now, probably 70 or 75%. In the second tier of benefits, you had 3 options: the war service, the war service gratuity you got at exit. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, it was an account that was equivalent to what you got for your war service gratuity. You could use it to set up a household, pots and pans, furniture. There were a few other limited uses you could use that draw on that account for. That's what the vast majority of people did. And you had access to your job if it still existed. So most people went back to work, they used that money, set themselves up in their post-war bungalow in suburbia, and got on with their lives. And that would have amounted to, depending on the length of their service, somewhere between about $150 and maybe just over $1,000 if they were long service overseas. It was ratio depending on your months of service and every 6-month period you spent overseas. That was very little access by status Indian vets. The other two options were training or education. You go to university or vocational school with support and funding, or you could do the Veterans Land Act, was the other major reestablishment one. And that provided up to $6,000 combination of loan or grant. If you paid off your loan in good standing, the last $2,320 would be forgiven as a grant. And that was fine, but you couldn't use that on a reserve because reserve lands were held in trust by the Crown. And so a bank could not foreclose, therefore you could not use any credit if you lived on a reserve. So VLA couldn't be used on reserve unless they changed it. So they made a special section, 35A, which allowed people to access, if they were on reserve or on Crown land, they could access just the grant portion of $2,320. That wasn't enough to get a viable farm going, but that's what, in fact, about 75 or 80% roughly of status Indian veterans used. Because Indian Affairs pushed them to get that. They could get the largest amount. They could get most of that 2320. But that was meant to reestablish you in a career that would allow you to support your family. And Indian Affairs used it to subsidize their on-reserve housing budget. They'd say, oh, no, don't do that. You just get $500 doing that. If you do this, you can get 2320. We'll get you a house. Not a full house. You could get like bare studs inside. But usually Indian Affairs would kick in a few $100 and finish the inside. So you'd get a house. That might help your standard of living. It does nothing to reestablish you with a job, a career, and a future. And that became the problem, is Indian Affairs kind of mutates the purpose of that program because it was the most amount of money. From their perspective, they were helping Indigenous veterans get the most money, but they weren't getting reestablished in a way that allowed them to have a job and a career that would support themselves and their families going forward. They got a house, and that was it, which was on reserve and then not so easily sold or not as valued as on a reserve housing. Yes?
World War II, the United States Marine Corps used Native people from the Navajo tribe in New Mexico. And the signals, when they were doing their Pacific crossings of the fighting the Japanese, because the Japanese couldn't understand the native language.
Yeah.
So it was great.
Yep.
Did Canada do anything similar to that?
Yeah, these are the code talker units that you're talking about. And the Marine Corps was the one force that went into this the heaviest. There were about 900 Navajo that served in the U.S. Marine Corps as code talkers all throughout the Pacific Theater. The U.S. Army experimented a little bit with code talker units using other nations in the U.S. They struggled, though, to find enough people who were fluent native speakers of their own language because assimilation and education had been highly successful at basically destroying most of those languages. And so the Army, U.S. Army, never really went into it. The Canadian Army did not have any formalized structure for this. I suspect there would have been some regiments, maybe that had large numbers of Algonquin speakers or Cree speakers, for instance, where maybe a thinking outside the box commander might have said, hey, we've got a few of you, we can use that for quick signals within their own particular unit. But it was never formalized or structured. The only case where Canadian Indigenous men were used in a code talker function was actually by the U.S. 8th Army Air Force in Britain. And they had a program where they actually came to the Canadian military and said, can you get together a large group of people who can speak? In this case, it was Cree. So several dozen Canadian Cree code talkers went on secondment. I think these were some of these Cree code talkers. Charlie Tompkins was one of these. and they were seconded, came from all over the Canadian Armed Forces, Air Force, Navy, Army, were seconded to the US 8th Army Air Force for about 6 or 8 months in 1943, late 42, 43, I believe. And they had they did a test to see if this was going to be effective. Ultimately, the US Air Force decided not to proceed with it, and those Canadian personnel were returned to Canadian Forces duty. But it was never formalized in the Canadian military. Good question.